all of our problems are solvable. The question for us is, will we solve them? Will we have the imagination to find solutions that are scalable, that can reach everybody on Earth? Because the message of one shared world, the message of everything we're hearing today, is that because we live in an interconnected world, we must recognize that it's interdependence. Recognizing our interdependence must be a foundation of solving our problems. And because of that, we recognize that making sure that we are doing everything to empower and assist the most vulnerable people on Earth isn't about charity. It's about what it takes to build a safer world for everyone within a context of a framework of human rights for all. And for that reason, it's my pleasure to introduce our next panel, which will explore poverty and inequality in an interconnected world and our mutual responsibilities for addressing it. And that includes our player coach, Jackie Chimhanzi, the CEO of the African Leadership Institute, Max Frieder, co-founder of Artolution, Seema Jayachandran, professor of economics at Northwestern, and the incomparable Naidoo, the former South Africa Minister for Reconstruction and Development. Over to you, Jackie.
So glad to be on the conversation. Jackie, I think you might need to unmute.
A very warm welcome to all our participants from wherever you are in the world. This panel is really on how to leverage our interdependence and our common humanity to solve issues relating to inequality and poverty. And I'm sure, as you all know, because of COVID, due to the pandemic, inequality is on the rise and poverty is on the rise as well. The inequality gap is growing. To discuss this with me, I've got a very esteemed and eclectic panel. I've got Naidoo, a former minister in the government of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. I've got Dr. Seema Jayachandran, a professor of economics at Northwestern University, whose research has dealt with developing country economies. I've also got Dr. Max Frieder. He's the executive director and co-founder of Artolution, not Revolution, Artolution. He looks at how art can be used to inform social aspects and to find solutions within communities. So to start off with, I'd like to start with Jay. I'd really like to know from you, Jay, how did we arrive at this moment? And this moment where we desperately need each other, but for some reason we're very intolerant of each other and we cannot seem to work together to find solutions and to find common ground. So how do we solve inequality if we cannot find each other?
Jackie, thank you very much. And it's great to be here on the panel. You know, I'm an old trade unionist by occupation, and still I'm an activist today. So I think back to our own history in South Africa. You know, we had an invincible apartheid regime supported by Western governments with the most powerful army that kept us under repression and control for literally decades. And it's only when people actually lose fear of the government and where government starts to fear the people that we have change. And that change comes about because a majority of people say, we've had enough. This is what happened in South Africa in the 80s, an incredibly difficult period in our history in which a powerful army and regime was brought to its knees because we mobilized ourselves. We organized ourselves from the bottom up. And we built a global campaign where people-to-people solidarity put pressure on Western governments to isolate South Africa. So if one looks at it, in the challenges we face today of poverty, inequality, a rising authoritarianism, the rise of right-wing populism, what do we have? We have people. And if people remain bystanders, then all power rises up to the hands of our leaders. And we become bystanders. And that's the fundamental issue, that we lack the type of civil society activism that we had, that built social movements that are not NGOs, service providers, professionalized, answering more to bean counters that give them money in Seattle or in the air-conditioned offices in London or New York, but actually answering to the society. So here we have a situation where the vast majority of people feel marginalized. They are aggrieved. They don't trust public institutions. In South Africa, even in our lifetime where we fought for freedom, people don't even register to vote because they don't believe in this democracy, because it's been captured. And so in this context, where there's a great deal of discontent, and we have a leadership that's completely lacking political will or imagination, if we look up, we're never going to find solutions. It's if we look down and we see millions of young people doing things, building the grassroots of a new type of activism, not even the activism that influenced and drove us to build mass movements, but a different type of activism where we build an authentic intergenerational conversation which supports activism, and which we build an accountability of civil society, not to hang out in the UN conferences in some fancy hotel and earn per diems, but get down onto the ground in the informal settlements, in the factory shops and mines, in the rural villages, and organize ourselves. Otherwise, we will continue to move on a trajectory that takes us closer, not just to a planetary crisis, a civilizational crisis, or climate crisis, or pandemic within which our governments are taking away rights that we've earned and won over decades. We will be contemplating the extinction of us as a species, and unfortunately, every other species that we share our planet with. So I think it goes back to the basics. Organize, or you starve, and you face extinction.
Thanks, Jay. And I'd like to bring Max in here. Based on the work that you do, talk to us about how do you activate people's agency? How do you make people realize the agency they have and to use that agency for change?
I think agency is an incredible word, and I love what Jay was just talking about, that it has to come from the people themselves. There's really no other choice. I think agency is this feeling that whether people like it or not, there's this feeling that there's a constant inequality. And so the question becomes, how can unexpected or unconventional means create that action? So a lot of the work that we do with Artolution is being able to use large-scale murals, building interactive percussive sculptures that are trash and recycled materials that come from making songs, doing performance, puppetry, dance, all as ways of talking about human rights, being able to create action that is able to last, that's able to continue with locally led teams in different crisis-affected communities, working in different refugee camps and different conflict zones. So what we're seeing is when you see the massive disparity, there needs to be dialogues and conversations that can be relatable, that can feel that an intergenerational dialogue is possible. So that can be something where using mediums that might bring out fun, might be able to bring out engagement and excitement, can be a way of bringing people to the table. It can be a way of saying, okay, how can we get the children, the adolescents, the parents, their grandparents, all being able to pick up a paintbrush and have a conversation to paint, or being able to all come together and be part of a performance. And so the question becomes, when this starts at a local level, then how can this happen, for example, in the Rohingya refugee camps, where we have a team of artists being able to talk to people in the South Sudanese refugee crisis in Uganda, and then being able to say, actually, we're dealing with a lot of the same issues of poverty, inequity, of problems that are existing from a very, as you said, Jay, hierarchical type of a stance. And so being able to create a forum where that can exist, where it's really about them being able to have those dialogues with one another. And I think one example of this, in a very kind of specific way, is that we've had, for example, one of the women that we work with, her name was Dildar, and she had severe trauma of losing her entire family, and had shock-based mutism, where she didn't speak for 9 months. And the first time that she spoke, she said, my responsibility is to work with women and with girls, to have them to share their stories. And now she's one of our lead artists in the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, the largest refugee camp in history to have ever existed. Right now there's over 1.2 million displaced people from the Rakhine state of Myanmar in Bangladesh. And that she has now been able to be in contact with other women in other parts of the world and starting to tell their stories and saying, how can we use the arts? How can we use performance? How can we use our voices to be able to raise awareness to people all over the world and to each other? So this feeling of combating social isolation, feeling that there's connection, social cohesion, and maybe most importantly, a feeling that creativity and excitement can be a way to maybe break some of those barriers to be able to create something that's really meaningful.
Oh, fantastic. So let's move from art and creativity to economics and policy. Seema, these challenges, are they solvable?
It's great to be here, Jackie, and I'm not going to take offense with that little giggle about economics. I think the problems are solvable. Most of the world is living on less than $10 a day, and all of us on this panel and many of the people watching have many more resources. And so, I think there's one reason why it's solvable is that we can redistribute. We as people who are fortunate to have comfortable lives, I think have a moral responsibility to solve some of this inequality. And I think besides just the moral argument, there's a win-win. Just as earlier in the summit, there was conversations, that solving climate change is good for everyone. I think there are many ways in which reducing global inequality and reducing poverty can benefit other people. So yes, I completely agree with Jay and Max that the solutions we are going to be largely from the grassroots, and but those of us who are living in other countries can play a role and can benefit. So I think climate change is a good example. Some of my research is on farmers in Uganda who are clearing forests because they can't afford a $50 US hospital bill. And so, if we can solve that problem of poverty, we've also helped solve problems of disappearing biodiversity and climate change. I think another reason we should all be invested in solving this problem of global poverty is just innovation. Many of us benefited from a vaccine that was created by Turkish immigrants to Germany, and there are many more talented people who could be creating global solutions who aren't getting that opportunity because they haven't had a healthy childhood. They're not getting the education they deserve. And so if we can solve this problem of poverty, we can all benefit in those ways.
Okay, great. So maybe over to you, Jay. Seema says it's a win-win. It's obvious, it's intuitive. So if it's so obvious, if it's so intuitive, why aren't we doing it? You've been in government before. So what is the mindset of politicians in approaching these problems to say, I'm the American president, how do I help Africa?
Well, the challenge is that you're leaving power in the hands of men, and particularly men of my generation who should be grandfathers and elders, because they understand so little about technology or the world that young people live in. So I think it's time we push them into retirement, and especially go beyond a liberation struggle mantle that we've been carrying for decades. It's now 65 years old. Take a break. Hand over power. Pass the baton. So, and I think the second thing is that, the idea of our governments in the past has always been that they will be the independent arbitrator between the interests of the market. For example, in this pandemic, have any of us followed the money? What Pfizer is reporting is that their profits have gone up from 3 billion to 33 billion. So in the context of everything we're talking about, vaccine, who's actually benefited when tens of millions have lost jobs, have been plunged into poverty? And here we have the wealth of the 1% in the United States during the pandemic has gone out by $1 trillion. So there's something fundamentally flawed with the system. And we have these foundations today that have benefited from the system. It's like apartheid. A white minority benefited from apartheid, then pretended that they knew nothing about apartheid. Just like the 1% pretends they know nothing about climate change and what they did to contribute to the problems. Whereas in Africa, we've contributed virtually nothing to the climate crisis. But we face the consequences. So are we still going to put our hands in the hands of those that perpetuate a dominant Western culture? No. Africa today has 60% of the remaining uncultivated arable land, yet we're the epicenter of hunger. 240 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. And yet there is a massive land grab taking place across Africa by countries and corporates that is displacing millions of women, because women produce 90% of our food in Africa. And the only barrier to them being successful, not just in becoming smallholder farmers, but tackling hunger, is legal title to land, microfinance to put in irrigation, build their seed banks, to put in some type of facility that helps them to preserve their product and to have access to the market and cutting out the middlemen. So these are fundamental issues that we have to tackle. But these don't feature even in the debates in the United Nations. It's about organizing ourselves, and the one advice I give to young people, you question everyone and question everything. And if anyone tells you they have a solution, they're lying through their teeth. We have this unique opportunity to co-create something new, a fundamentally new way of looking at democracy, at international cooperation, at solidarity, at economy, at politics, at family, and ridding ourselves of this toxic masculinity and patriarchy that permeates everything we do. And so until we reach that point and say, we're not fiddling around the edges here, the system is broken, and therefore we need to construct and co-create through an intergenerational, authentic intergenerational debate, a new system. And by doing that, we need to bang on the doors of those in power and not let them float into the stratosphere with their notions of how they're going to solve our problems when they have never done anything in the last decades that we've been going through the problem, to a point where we sit at a precipice of an environmental emergency. And I don't think we have the time to have this political bullshit correctness when it comes to talking to people who are elders and people who hold power anymore.
Okay, fantastic, Jay. Let me bring Seema in. You mentioned something interesting. You talked about toxic masculinity. And Seema, I'm aware that some of your research has focused on gender, right? Can we just talk about inclusive structures and what role they have to play in reducing poverty and inequality?
Yeah, I think what Jay said is not just kind of important per se to reduce toxic masculinity, but I think it's part of the solution to reducing poverty. There's a lot of evidence that when you give money to moms, they help their kids and spend on their kids, and it helps the next generation. And women have wonderful ideas that right now, a lot of my work is in India, where talented women aren't able to go on to college or have careers, and we can have. There's evidence that when women come into politics, they make different decisions, they govern very well. And so if we can create more opportunities for women, we make the pie bigger. So, I think we should be redistributing the pie, cutting it up differently. But if we can make the pie bigger, that's wonderful. And I think one of the most important ways is to make sure that women and girls are getting the same opportunities as men and boys.
Okay, great. And obviously inclusion takes different forms. So you're talking about gender inclusion. And Jay, I hear you coming from Africa, you speaking about inclusion from a youth perspective. So Africa is the youngest continent in the world, yet we have the oldest leaders. And we need new leaders around the table to co-create solutions because they bring new thinking, new energy, new ideas, right? Max, what does co-creation look like? The co-creation of solutions using your approach and methodology as an artist?
Yeah, I think the inequality that we've seen, which is at this precipice right now, inequality in whether it be wealth, what Seema was talking about gender, and saying how can we use methodologies that are being able to bring up and to be able to rise up voices that have many times not been at the table. And that's something where you were talking about how do we take private sector, public sector, totally grassroots, all of the, let's say, inequalities of these very large hierarchies and say, how do we create a shift in the system, both internal and external, where you're banging on the doors to create a change and from the inside changing policy of how how resources are being allocated. And that's something that I know for us with the work we're doing with Artolution, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do you use these large institutions? But really, the whole point is that you can have local artists, especially female artists, being able to come out and say, we matter, what we say matters, and how we're going to say it matters. And being able to have that come to the forefront matters now more than ever before in history.
Okay, great. And just to close, just one comment here from John Neve. He says, if every leader on the planet was a woman, we would all be in a better place. I agree. I wonder why. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to Jamie.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie, Max, Seema, Jay. That was just incredibly important for everything that we stand for at One Shared World, for what we're all doing today. And I think there was a lot of hope in everything that you said, that there is hope we can solve these problems if we actually empower people to solve them. And there was justifiably a lot of anger that we live in this world that's so unfair, uneven, unjust. And that isn't just harming the people who are at the most vulnerable, it's harming everybody. There's a better future, but we should be angry that we live in a world where our solvable problems aren't being solved.